I still can't believe this started because of a floor. Seriously, I was just supposed to replace the damn floors in this guy's apartment. Quick job, get paid, move on. But somehow, by the time I left that night, I was sitting at his kitchen table eating dinner he made just for me, and my brain was doing somersaults because, well, I kind of wanted to ask him out. Yeah, it got weird in the best way possible, so here's how it went down. I'm a flooring guy. Been at it for a few years now. Mostly jobs where I don't really talk to the clients much. Drop by, rip out old carpet, lay down new hardwood or laminate, say goodbye. But this was different. I got a call from a dude named Ethan who needed his floors replaced in his one-bedroom downtown apartment. He sounded chill on the phone, and the address wasn't far from where I live, so I figured, why not? When I got there, I wasn't prepared for how casual and warm the place felt. The building was one of those old brick ones with the creaky wooden stairs and fire escapes. Kinda charming if you're into that urban vibe. Ethan met me at the door. He was maybe mid-30s, with these dark curly hair and a face that was both approachable and a little shy. Not the usual, hey, I want to renovate kind of guy. He smiled like he was glad I was there, but also a bit nervous about having someone work in his space. We shook hands, and he showed me around. The floors were a mess, scratched up, uneven in spots. He wanted something simple, light-colored wood laminate, nothing flashy. As I started pulling up the old flooring, he disappeared into his room and came back with a couple of beers, which was totally unexpected. He said, "Thought you might want something to drink while you work." I wasn't used to clients being that thoughtful. Usually, it's all business, no chit-chat. We started talking, just small stuff at first, about the neighborhood, favorite spots for coffee, weird neighbors, the kind of stuff you don't expect to get into when you're doing manual labor for someone you just met. But Ethan had this way of making the conversation easy, like we were old friends catching up, rather than me being the worker and him the client. Hours went by. I was sweaty and probably looked like a mess, but he didn't seem to mind. When I finished pulling up the old floor, he asked if I wanted to wait for him to clear out the furniture so I could start putting down the new panels the next day. I was planning to just come back anyway, but something made me say yes, like I wanted to be around him a little longer. Then, out of nowhere, he asked if I was hungry. I said I was starving. Next thing I know, he's in the kitchen pulling out ingredients and cooking this simple but amazing pasta dish. The smell filled the whole apartment, and I kept thinking, okay, this is not what I expected when I agreed to replace some floors. We ate at that tiny table by the window, the city lights blinking in the background. The conversation got deeper. Talk about work, family, what brought us to this city. I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks. And honestly, I think he did too. By the end of the night, I was no longer just the guy replacing floors. I was the guy Ethan wanted to keep around. And I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. That's when he made me stay for dinner. I swear I'd never planned on this being more than a job. But sometimes, life throws you a curveball when you're just trying to lay down some wood. And man, was I glad it did. We sat there, the two of us, in that little kitchen nook, and for a moment, it was like time slowed down. I don't know how to explain it, but Ethan's smile, the way he was nervously tucking a stray curl behind his ear, the soft jazz playing from a corner speaker, it all felt like the start of something. And yeah, I was probably reading way too much into a dinner invitation from a guy whose floors I was supposed to replace, but honestly, who cares? Life's too short for overthinking. After we finished eating, Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at me like he was deciding whether or not to say something. I was about to ask if he wanted me to get started on the new flooring tomorrow, when he blurted out, "I don't usually have people over." Well, not like this. I laughed nervously and said, "Yeah, I get that. I'm usually the one who just does the work and leaves." He shrugged, a little awkward but genuine. Sometimes it's nice to just hang out, even if it's with a stranger who's covered in sawdust. I grinned. Well, I'll take that as a compliment. We both laughed, and that broke the last bit of ice between us. I felt a little spark. I don't know if it was just me, but it was there. After dinner, I helped him clear some of the furniture, and we joked about how I must be the worst helper ever since I kept getting in the way more than actually helping. Ethan was easygoing, and I could tell he appreciated the company. He kept stealing glances at me, and I caught myself looking back, feeling my heart race all over again. At one point, he said, "You want a coffee? I know it's late, but I'm guessing you could use a pick-me-up." I nodded, and while he was making the coffee, I took a quick look around the apartment. It felt like a reflection of him, simple, a little eclectic, and full of little things that hinted at his personality. A couple of framed photos on the shelves, a stack of books in the corner, a guitar leaning against the wall. It was cozy. When he handed me the coffee, our fingers brushed for a second, and I swear my whole body tensed up like I'd just touched a live wire. Ethan caught it too, because he smiled that shy, genuine smile again. I don't even think he said anything. We just sat there, sipping our drinks, letting the silence settle in a way that didn't feel awkward. After a while, he looked at me and said, "So, why floors? What got you into this?" I shrugged, feeling a little exposed, but also wanting to share. Honestly, I was always kind of a handyman growing up, fixing stuff around the house, helping my folks. Floors just stuck because there's this weird satisfaction in seeing something worn out get new life. It feels like, I don't know, like I'm leaving a little mark, making something better. Plus, I like the physical work. Keeps me grounded. He nodded thoughtfully. That's cool. I've always been more of a creative type, I guess. Writing, mostly. It's messy, though. Never as straightforward as floors. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and saw something in his eyes that told me he wasn't just talking about the writing. Maybe he felt stuck or unsure about a lot of things, just like I sometimes did. There was a kind of vulnerability there that made me want to reach out, to say, "Hey, I get it." Before I could say anything, he stood up and stretched. "I should probably let you get some rest. Big day tomorrow." I nodded, feeling the sudden awkwardness creeping back. "Yeah. Thanks for dinner, Ethan." Seriously, it was unexpected but really nice. He smiled, this time more confidently. "Glad you stayed." I packed up my gear quietly, trying not to make it obvious that I didn't want to leave just yet. At the door, Ethan hesitated for a second, then said, "Hey, if you're not doing anything after work tomorrow, maybe you want to grab a drink?" No pressure, just, unwind. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. I managed a half smile and said, "Yeah, I'd like that." He grinned and opened the door wide. "Cool. I'll see you tomorrow then." Walking back to my own place that night, I kept replaying the moments over and over. How natural it felt to just talk, to laugh, to be around someone who didn't judge me for being covered in dust and sweat. There was something about Ethan that pulled me in, something real and easy. I'm not usually the guy who gets swept up in situations like this, but maybe that's what made it so surprising. Sometimes, all it takes is a little unexpected invitation to turn a job into something way more than that. And honestly, I wasn't ready to see where this went, but I was curious as hell. The next morning, I showed up right on time, toolbox in hand, ready to get to work. Ethan was there waiting by the door, looking more relaxed than the day before. He'd thrown on a simple t-shirt and jeans, and his hair was still that little mess of curls that made me want to run my fingers through it for some reason. I caught myself staring and quickly looked away like a complete idiot. He grinned and said, "Ready to make my floors look less like a crime scene?" I laughed. "You're selling it a bit short, but yeah, let's do this." We worked side by side, moving furniture, measuring, cutting planks, and fitting pieces together. It was honest, physical work, but with Ethan around, it didn't feel like a chore. We kept chatting, the conversation flowing easier than I expected. He told me about his writing projects, some finished, some frustratingly incomplete, and I shared stories about jobs that went wrong, clients who changed their minds last minute, that kind of thing. At one point, while I was fitting a tricky corner, Ethan came over with his phone and showed me a poem he'd just written. It was raw and vulnerable, the kind of thing that makes you uncomfortable and hopeful at the same time. I told him it was really good, that he had a way with words. He smiled but looked a little embarrassed, like he wasn't used to compliments. By midday, we were both covered in dust and sweat, but the floors were looking amazing. The light wood brightened the entire space, making Ethan's apartment feel fresh and new. He looked around, obviously proud but also a little surprised. "I can't believe this is my place now," he said softly. You did all the hard part, letting me tear it apart first. I joked. He laughed, and it felt easy, natural. After I finished, Ethan surprised me again by grabbing his keys. I know a great little dive bar nearby. Want to grab that drink now? You said you'd be up for it. I was tempted to say no. I had stuff to do, and honestly, I wasn't sure where this was going, but the look in his eyes was hopeful, so I said yes. The bar wasn't far, just a block away, and it was one of those cozy places with worn-in booths and dim lighting. We grabbed 2 beers and sat down, the noise of the bustling city fading away behind our conversation. We talked about everything and nothing, the best places to hike outside the city, weird movies we loved, the kind of music that gets stuck in our heads. It felt like we'd known each other for years instead of, like 24 hours. There was this easy rhythm between us, like a conversation that could go on forever. At some point, Ethan leaned forward and said, I'm really glad you came tonight. I don't do this kind of thing often. I looked at him seriously for the first time. Neither do I. But sometimes you just have to take a chance, right? He smiled, a little shy but genuine. Yeah, I think you're right. There's a long pause. That kind of pause where both of you are suddenly aware of the space between you. I could feel my heart pounding, and I wasn't sure if he felt it too. I wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, but I didn't want to rush it or make things weird. Just as I was about to say something stupid, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his face fell a little. Sorry, that's work. I've got to take this. I nodded, feeling the moment slip away. He stepped outside to answer, and I sat there, nursing my beer, wondering if I'd ever get another chance like this. But then he came back in, caught my eye, and said, Wait here. I'll be right back. I watched him disappear out the door again, and my mind was racing. When he returned, he was holding 2 tickets. For a poetry reading next Friday, he said, a little breathless. Would you want to come with me? I blinked, surprised. Yeah, I'd like that. He smiled that smile again, and I felt like maybe this was the start of something real. Not just a guy you hire to fix your floors or a quick dinner. Something that could actually last. As we finished our drinks and stepped back out into the cool night air, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected jobs can turn into the most unexpected connections. And this one? It was just getting started. The week between that night at the bar and the poetry reading felt like a weird mix of anticipation and normal life. I kept finding myself smiling at random moments, thinking about Ethan, about those tickets in his hand, about how something that started with floors was turning into a story I wasn't ready to stop telling. We texted a bit. Nothing heavy, just little check-ins, jokes, and a few photos he sent me of his latest writing scribbles. And I sent back pictures of the finished floors, which he seemed genuinely proud of. It was casual, but it had this undercurrent of something more, something electric. When Friday rolled around, I found myself getting nervous in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Not because I was about to go to some poetry reading, but because I was going with Ethan. I kept thinking about how he'd invited me, how his voice had cracked just a bit when he asked. I liked that side of him, the honest, slightly uncertain part that made him feel real and human. I showed up at his apartment right on time, and he opened the door with that same shy smile. He was wearing this soft, navy sweater and jeans, looking effortlessly put together in a way I could never quite pull off. He handed me a coat and said, "Ready for an evening of pretentious art and bad coffee?" I laughed. Sounds perfect. The place was a small, cozy bookstore turned cafe, tucked away on a quiet street. Low lighting, mismatched chairs, the smell of old paper and espresso beans hanging in the air. Ethan led me to a tiny table near the front, where a few others were already seated, waiting for the event to start. When the reading began, Ethan's whole demeanor shifted. He was completely absorbed, eyes brightening with every poem, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. After the first few readings, he leaned over and whispered, "There's something about hearing words out loud that makes them hit differently, you know." I nodded, watching him watch the poets. He looked so at home here, like this was where he belonged. After the event, we wandered outside into the cool night, the city wrapping around us like a soft blanket. Neither of us wanted the night to end. "Want to grab some food?" Ethan asked, voice hopeful. "Absolutely," I said. We found a small diner that was still open, and we slid into a booth by the window. Over greasy fries and late-night coffee, the conversation turned more personal. Ethan told me about his childhood, growing up in a small town where he often felt like the odd one out. I shared stories about my family, the struggles with figuring out who I was and where I fit. There was a kind of honesty between us that felt rare and precious. Neither of us was trying to impress or hide. We were just two guys sharing pieces of ourselves over diner coffee and flickering neon lights. At some point, Ethan reached across the table and brushed a crumb off my shirt. The touch was light but electric, and I caught his eye. There was this unspoken question in his gaze, and I realized I wanted to say yes before I even knew what the question was. When we finally left the diner, the streets were quiet and the air was crisp. We walked side by side, shoulders almost touching, and for a moment I thought about how easy it felt just to be close to him. At his door, Ethan hesitated. Then he said, "I know we barely know each other, but would you want to come in, maybe just for a little while?" My heart was pounding. I wanted to say yes so badly it hurt. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I'd like that." Inside, the apartment felt different at night, softer somehow. Ethan put on some music, a slow, quiet playlist that filled the space between us. We sat down on the couch, and the silence stretched comfortably. Then, almost without thinking, he reached out and took my hand. It was warm and steady, and I felt a jolt that went straight to my chest. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his eyes, only something honest and open. I don't remember who made the first move, but soon enough, we were kissing. It was gentle at first, tentative like we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, full of all the things we hadn't said yet. The nervousness, the hope, the quiet longing. Afterward, we just sat there, hands entwined, saying little but feeling everything. I stayed longer than I thought I would. When I finally left, walking back to my place under the streetlights, I realized that what started as a job, just replacing floors, had become something I didn't want to let go of. And honestly, I don't think Ethan wanted that either. The days that followed felt like I was living in two parallel worlds. One where I was just a guy who replaced floors for a living, and another where I was someone who had just kissed a guy like Ethan, someone who made the ordinary feel electric. I kept replaying that night in my head, the softness of his lips, the way his hand fit perfectly in mine, the quiet comfort of being with someone who seemed to get it. We started seeing each other more, not necessarily in any official way, but enough that I stopped thinking of him just as a client. I'd swing by his apartment after work, sometimes to hang out, sometimes to help with little things around the place. He'd make coffee while I puttered around, and we'd talk about everything, our fears, our dreams, stupid stuff that made us laugh. It was easy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could just be me. One evening, about a week after that first kiss, I was sitting on his couch, a beer in hand, when Ethan looked at me with this serious expression I hadn't seen before. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Shoot," I replied, curious. He hesitated, then said, "Where do you see this going?" "Us, I mean." I felt a knot in my stomach. I hadn't exactly planned out the "what's next" part, but I knew I didn't want this to be just a fling. Honestly, I don't know. But I do want to see where it goes. With you. He smiled, relieved. Me too. I guess I'm just scared. I haven't really done this before. Neither have I admitted, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are. He reached over and squeezed my hand. Good. Because I want to be with you. That moment felt like a turning point. Up until then, everything had been kind of casual, maybe even a little uncertain. But hearing him say that made it real. Made me want to be more than just the guy who fixed his floors. We started spending more time together, and things felt natural. I met a couple of his friends at a small gathering he threw one Saturday night. They were warm and welcoming, and it felt good to be included in his world. Ethan was clearly comfortable around them, laughing, joking, the kind of guy who could light up a room without even trying. One afternoon, I showed up at his place with a surprise, a little plant for the corner of his living room. I figured it would brighten the space and remind him of something living and growing, much like whatever this was between us. He loved it, cradling the pot like it was something precious. "It's kind of like us, huh?" I teased. He laughed, a little embarrassed but clearly touched. "Yeah, I guess it is." But it wasn't all perfect. There were moments when the weight of our pasts and fears crept in. I caught him staring out the window sometimes, lost in thought, and I knew he was wrestling with things he wasn't ready to say. I tried to be patient, letting him come to me when he was ready. One night, after a long day, we found ourselves sitting on the floor, backs against the couch, just talking. Ethan opened up about his fears of being hurt, of not being accepted fully, even after all this time. I listened as honestly as I could, telling him I had my own scars too, and that I wasn't going anywhere. He looked at me then, eyes shining. "Thank you for staying. I'm not going anywhere," I promised. The floors in his apartment had become more than just a project. They were the foundation for something real. Every plank, every nail, every late-night conversation felt like we were building more than just a home. We were building trust. And while I still sometimes found myself wondering where this would lead, one thing was clear. I was all in. For the first time in a long time, I believed in something more than just the next job, the next paycheck. I believed in us. The floors were solid now, but so were we. And that made all the difference. The more time I spent with Ethan, the more I realized how much space he was quietly carving out in my life. And honestly, I wasn't mad about it. It wasn't this instant fire kind of thing. It was slow and steady, like the floors I laid down, piece by piece until everything fit just right. Except with Ethan, there was this undercurrent, a subtle tension that I couldn't ignore, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your mind race, even when you're just sitting next to someone watching a dumb TV show. One evening, after a long day of work, I showed up at Ethan's place with a half-baked plan to cook dinner. I'm no chef, but I figured pasta was a safe bet. When I knocked, he opened the door wearing this oversized hoodie and a smile that made me forget what I was supposed to be doing. "Surprise dinner?" he teased, more like me trying not to burn the kitchen down. I joked back, stepping inside. We moved into his kitchen, which was small but cozy, and I started chopping ingredients while he poured us both a glass of wine. The way he watched me, like I was doing something worth watching, made me feel a little self-conscious and a little thrilled. So he said, "How's the floor business treating you? Still making the world a better place, one plank at a time?" I laughed. "Yeah, something like that. Though I'm thinking of adding dinner chef to my resume after tonight." He grinned, walking over to pour sauce into the pan. "Well, I'm happy to be your first client." As we cooked, the conversation drifted from work to more personal stuff. Ethan told me about his latest writing struggles, how sometimes the words just wouldn't come, no matter how hard he tried. I shared how the physicality of my job was a relief. No pretending, no filters, just hard work and visible results. When the pasta was finally ready, we sat down at his little table, and I watched him take his first bite. The way his eyes lit up, that was all the validation I needed. After dinner, we settled on the couch, the city lights flickering through the window behind him. He scooted closer until our legs bumped, then his hand found mine. It was casual but charged, like a current running beneath the surface. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. "Anything," I replied, heart starting to beat faster. "Do you think it's complicated? Like, could it get messy?" I thought about it for a second. Sure, it could, but maybe it was those complications that made it worth the risk. "Yeah, maybe, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are." He smiled, that vulnerable smile that made me want to protect him and be honest all at once. "I am." We leaned in then, and this time it wasn't tentative. It was the kind of kiss that said, "I want this," even if we didn't have all the answers. When we pulled apart, our foreheads rested together, and I could feel his breath, steady and warm. In the weeks that followed, things between us deepened in ways I hadn't expected. We started sharing routines, morning coffee together, late night talks about nothing and everything, even little rituals like picking out movies or taking Sunday walks through the park. Ethan's apartment felt more like home every time I was there. One Sunday, we were sprawled on the floor, a game of Scrabble between us. I was winning, but Ethan's competitive streak had kicked in, and he was determined to catch up. "Hey, I just realized," he said, placing down a word that scored big. "Your floors aren't the only thing I'm falling for around here." I blinked, caught off guard, and then laughed. "Smooth. Real smooth." He grinned. "I'm serious." That moment felt like a quiet confession, like the kind that doesn't need to be shouted to be understood. I reached out and grabbed his hand, squeezing it. Me too. Not everything was perfect. There were days when doubts crept in, moments when I caught Ethan hesitating, like he was fighting off ghosts from his past, or when I felt my own walls going up, scared of letting someone in too far. But we talked through those moments, not always perfectly, but honestly. And that made all the difference. One night, as I was leaving his place, Ethan stopped me in the doorway. "Hey," he said, voice low, "thanks for staying, for all of this." I smiled, stepping in for a quick hug. "You don't have to thank me." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. "I do. You make me feel seen." I heart-hitched. "Well, you make me want to be better. More than just the guy who fixes floors." We stood there for a moment, the city humming softly around us, and I knew this was something real. Something worth fighting for. And, honestly, I was ready. A few weeks later, Ethan and I found ourselves sitting on the floor of his apartment again. The floors were no longer just newly laid planks. They had settled in, worn in just enough to feel lived in. We kicked back with mugs of tea, the kind of comfortable silence wrapping around us that only comes after you've spent enough time with someone to stop worrying about filling every moment. He looked over at me with that familiar, shy smile. "You know," he said, "I never imagined that replacing my floors would lead to all this." I chuckled, tracing circles on the wood with my finger. "Neither did I." But sometimes the things you least expect turn out to be the most important. He nodded, eyes warm. "You've changed how I see this place, how I see myself." I reached over and took his hand gently, "and you did the same for me, more than you know." There was no rush, no dramatic declarations. Just two people who had come together in the quiet ways that mattered, through honesty, patience, and shared moments that grew into something more. We leaned into each other, a soft, easy closeness that felt like home. Later, as I packed up my tools for the last time, because Ethan insisted the floors were done and I was officially part of the furniture, I realized this was more than a job ending. It was a chapter closing on the old version of my life and the start of something new. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real. Walking out the door, I glanced back to see Ethan standing there, smiling like he was glad I was sticking around. And I was, because sometimes the best things don't come from grand gestures or perfect moments, but from the little invitations, like dinner, a shared drink, a hand held when no one was looking. I've always believed that floors are the foundation of a home. Turns out, they're also the foundation of a story, our story, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take us next.